International landscape, analysis of Trump's economic agenda and trade relations with China and the EU by the end of 2025. Overview. The return of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency in January 2025 is expected to significantly impact international trade relations, particularly between the United States, the European Union, EU, and China. Trump's economic agenda, characterized by aggressive tariff policies and a focus on reducing trade deficits, poses both challenges and opportunities for the EU and China as they navigate the complexities of U.S. demands and their own economic priorities. Key themes and developments. 1. Tariff policies. Trump's economic agenda is anchored in the imposition of steep tariffs on imports from various trading partners. During his 2024 presidential campaign, he pledged to implement tariffs of 10 to 20% on most nations, with even higher rates of up to 60% on China. This approach is reminiscent of his first term's tactics, where tariffs on steel and aluminum initiated a wave of retaliatory measures from the EU and other trade partners. Timeline of key events. March 2018, initial tariffs on steel and aluminum set the tone for Trump's trade policies. 2024, Trump promises to escalate tariffs during his campaign. January 2025, Trump is inaugurated and the EU prepares for a challenging trade environment. 2. EU's strategic dilemma. As Trump resumes office, the EU finds itself in a precarious position. The bloc must balance its economic interests with China against the demands from the US to align more closely with its anti-China stance. Trump's threats of tariffs create a situation where the EU faces a lose-lose scenario. 1. Compliance with US demands. Fully decoupling from Chinese goods could trigger retaliation from Beijing and further harm the EU's already faltering economies. 2. Non-compliance. Ignoring U.S. pressures could lead to punitive tariffs on EU goods, exacerbating economic challenges. 3. Economic context in the EU. The economic landscape in the EU is fraught with challenges, including stagnation in major economies like Germany and France. Political instability is also prevalent, with leadership changes and economic crises looming. The EU's inability to maintain cohesive policies amid these pressures may further complicate its negotiations with the US. 4. Different perspectives on trade relations. Various analyses highlight the complexities of the U.S. EU-China trade dynamic. Source 1 emphasizes the likelihood of a trade conflict and the EU's defensive strategies against U.S. tariffs. Source 2 focuses on the psychological and economic pressures on European leaders as they confront Trump's agenda. Source 3 discusses the legal frameworks and mechanisms Trump may employ to enforce his trade policies. 5. Potential scenarios for 2025. 3 primary scenarios have emerged regarding the trajectory of U.S. EU-China relations under Trump's administration. 1. Grand bargain 10% chance, a scenario where Trump negotiates limited tariffs in exchange for EU commitments on defense spending and goods purchases. 2. Managed mess 70% chance, a more likely outcome where Trump reinstates previous tariffs, leading to retaliatory actions from the EU without escalating tensions further. 3. Perfect storm 20% chance, a scenario marked by immediate and harsh tariff implementations sparking a significant trade war and deteriorating relations between the US and the EU. 6. The role of China. China's position in this dynamic is critical. If Trump follows through on his proposed tariffs, the resulting trade shifts could lead to an influx of discounted Chinese goods in the EU, potentially undermining European manufacturing. The EU's response to this would likely involve enhanced trade defense measures against Chinese imports. Conclusion. Donald Trump's return to the White House heralds a tumultuous period for international trade relations, particularly between the US, the EU, and China. The EU's challenge lies in navigating the pressures from the US while safeguarding its economic interests with China. The unfolding scenarios will depend heavily on the interplay between U.S. tariff policies, European unity, and China's responses in the coming years. As these dynamics evolve, the EU will need to foster cohesion among its member states and develop strategies to mitigate the impacts of Trump's economic agenda on its economic stability and growth. The analysis of Donald Trump's economic agenda and its implications for international trade relations, particularly with the EU and China by the end of 2025, reveals several counterintuitive insights that challenge conventional expectations. Here are some key points to consider. 1. Perception versus reality of trade deficits. Trump's administration has historically emphasized the narrative of trade deficits as a measure of economic health. However, while Trump has continually criticized the EU for its trade surplus with the U.S., the data indicates that U.S. goods exports to the EU reached a record high of $370 billion in 2023. This suggests that the U.S. is economically intertwined with Europe much more than Trump's rhetoric might imply. The belief that the EU is entirely reliant on Chinese goods is similarly flawed. Many EU nations have significant exports to China, which complicates the notion of a one-sided dependency. 2. Retaliation and economic interdependence. The expectation that the EU will respond to U.S. tariffs with retaliation may overlook the complexity of the EU's internal dynamics. While a tit-for-tat response is anticipated, the EU's member states have varied interests and levels of dependence on China. For example, Germany's economy does not favor aggressive tariff actions against China due to its manufacturing ties, which suggests that EU unity might not hold under pressure, leading to divergent strategies that could weaken the EU's collective bargaining power against Trump's tariffs. 3. Trump's promises versus action. Trump's historical tendency to escalate rhetoric during campaigns has not always translated into immediate action upon taking office. The analysis highlights the possibility that Trump's administration might opt for a phased approach to tariffs rather than the sweeping measures he promised. This implies that market reactions and international relations may stabilize if Trump chooses to implement tariffs incrementally rather than all at once, contrary to expectations of an immediate economic shock. 4. The grand bargain scenario. The analysis posits a grand bargain scenario with only a 10% chance of occurring, which suggests a significant underestimation of the potential for negotiation and compromise, given the EU's complex security and economic landscape, particularly its reliance on U.S. military support amid tensions with Russia. There could be an unexpected willingness among EU leaders to make concessions to avoid economic fallout from aggressive U.S. trade policies. This contrasts sharply with the prevailing belief that the EU will rigidly oppose all U.S. demands. 5. China's role in EU dynamics. While many assume that Trump's trade war with China will lead the EU to side with the U.S. against Beijing, the reality may be more complex. EU members are likely to seek ways to maintain their economic relationships with China even as they navigate U.S. demands. This reflects a nuanced understanding of the EU's strategic interests, which may not align as neatly with U.S. foreign policy as anticipated. 6. Political turmoil in Europe. The analysis indicates that the EU is currently facing political instability, especially in major economies like Germany and France. This situation could influence EU leaders' responses to Trump, creating a scenario where domestic pressures may lead to appeasement rather than confrontation. The notion that political stability would lead to a unified front against U.S. policies may be overly simplistic, as existing turmoil could foster a lack of cohesion in trade strategy. 7. Long-term implications of tariff policies. While the immediate effects of Trump's tariff policies are framed as detrimental to European economies, there is a counterintuitive potential for long-term resilience. If the EU leverages these pressures to accelerate domestic reforms and innovation, it could emerge stronger. This viewpoint challenges the prevailing narrative that tariffs will uniformly damage European economies without considering the adaptive strategies that may arise in response. 8. The role of nationalism and populism. The analysis hints at the rise of populist movements within the EU, fueled by economic distress linked to U.S. policies. However, the extent to which this could destabilize the EU further is uncertain. Rather than leading to unified resistance against Trump, these movements may compel some nations to seek bilateral deals with the US to secure favorable terms, undermining collective EU responses. 9. Perception of economic security. Trump's focus on economic nationalism and protectionism could paradoxically push the EU towards greater integration and self-reliance. The idea that economic security concerns will lead to fragmentation overlooks the possibility that they might catalyze a more cohesive EU economic strategy as member states recognize the need to bolster their own defenses against external pressures. 10. Potential for cooperation on global issues. Despite the tensions, there exists the potential for unexpected cooperation between the US and EU on global issues such as climate change and security. The notion that a trade conflict would lead to a complete breakdown in relations does not account for the complex interdependencies that remain, suggesting a more nuanced future where both sides might find common ground despite their differences. In summary, the dynamics of international trade relations under Trump's economic agenda are not as straightforward as they may initially appear. The interplay of economic realities, political instability, and the potential for unexpected cooperation complicates the narrative around U.S EU-China relations, offering a range of possible outcomes that challenge conventional wisdom. The report on Donald Trump's economic agenda and its impact on trade relations with China and the EU up to 2025 contains several crucial insights that are likely to be overlooked by many. Here are some of the key points along with explanations of their significance. 1. The EU's balancing act. Many readers may focus on Trump's aggressive tariff proposals and overlook the nuanced position of the EU. The EU finds itself in a precarious situation, having to balance its economic ties with China while also responding to the demands of the US. This balancing act is significant because it highlights the EU's vulnerability. Leaders are not only facing external pressures but also internal divisions. The economic struggles in major EU economies like Germany and France could lead to a lack of unified action against US tariffs, ultimately weakening the EU's position globally. 2. Possible flood of Chinese goods. The potential for a flood of discounted Chinese goods entering the EU if Trump imposes high tariffs on China is critical but may be overlooked. This scenario could devastate European manufacturing, particularly in sectors already struggling due to economic stagnation. The significant implications for EU manufacturers and the potential for economic destabilization could lead to political unrest, making it vital to understand how Trump's policies may inadvertently harm European economies. 3. The timing of economic turmoil. The timeline of events shows that the EU is entering this turbulent period while already grappling with economic issues. This context is crucial because it suggests that any US-EU trade conflict could exacerbate existing economic problems, leading to more severe repercussions. Readers might miss how intertwined the timing of Trump's policies and the EU's economic challenges could be in shaping future relations. 4. Diverse EU responses. The report underscores the diverse responses among EU member states towards Trump's policies, particularly regarding China. Countries like Germany and Hungary have distinct economic interests that may lead them to resist EU-wide actions against China. This diversity within the EU could lead to fragmentation, which is significant because it could weaken the EU's collective bargaining power against US tariffs and further complicate transatlantic relations. 5. The scenarios for future relations. The report discusses 3 scenarios: grand bargain, managed mess, and perfect storm that could unfold in U.S EU-China relations. While many may focus on the most dire predictions, the likelihood of a managed mess 70% chance is crucial to understand. This scenario suggests a prolonged period of tension without outright warfare, which may lead to a slow deterioration of relations rather than a dramatic confrontation. This slower unraveling could have long-term implications for global trade dynamics and economic policies. 6. Trump's domestic political agenda. Trump's economic agenda is not just about international relations, it is also closely tied to his domestic political goals. The emphasis on tariffs as a method to protect American jobs resonates with his voter base. And this populist approach may overshadow more complex economic considerations. Readers might miss how domestic political pressures can shape international negotiations, leading to potentially unpredictable outcomes. 7. National security and trade policy intersection. The report highlights how Trump's trade policies are deeply intertwined with national security concerns. This intersection is significant because it may lead to policies that prioritize security over trade efficiency, potentially resulting in a more isolationist stance that could reshape global trade patterns. This perspective may be overlooked in discussions centered on economic metrics alone. 8. Impact of U.S. tech firms. The involvement of U.S. tech firms and their influence on Trump's policies is another critical yet potentially overlooked aspect. As firms like Elon Musk's become more intertwined with political dynamics, their interests may redirect U.S. trade policies, particularly regarding China. This relationship complicates the narrative of a straightforward political agenda, suggesting that corporate interests will play an increasingly significant role in shaping international trade relations. 9. Legal framework for tariffs. The report discusses the expected legal frameworks and mechanisms that Trump might utilize to implement his trade agenda. Many readers might overlook the complexity of these legal avenues, which could enable Trump to impose tariffs without significant pushback. Understanding the legal context is essential for predicting how trade disputes may evolve and what strategies the EU and China might employ in response. 10. Psychological factors in leadership. The psychological pressures on European leaders attending international forums like Davos could influence their decision-making. The report notes that fear and anxiety among EU leaders regarding their economic futures may lead to reactive rather than proactive policies. This psychological aspect is essential as it can lead to miscalculations in trade negotiations that have far-reaching consequences. By considering these overlooked aspects, it becomes clear that the intersection of economic agendas, political motivations, and psychological factors creates a complex web that will shape international trade relations through 2025 and beyond. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for anticipating future developments in U.S. EU-China relations and their broader implications on the global stage. 1. Impact of Trump's tariff policies on global trade dynamics. Trump's aggressive tariff agenda, including promises of 10 to 20% tariffs on most trading partners and up to 60% on China, is set to redefine global trade flows by the end of 2025. The implications for the EU are particularly severe, as high tariffs on Chinese goods could lead to a flood of discounted Chinese products entering EU markets. This scenario poses a significant threat to European manufacturing and could catalyze retaliatory measures, creating a tit-for-tat dynamic that exacerbates trade tensions. The EU's dependency on Chinese imports complicates its ability to respond effectively to U.S. tariff strategies, leading to potential economic stagnation and political instability within the bloc. 2. Transatlantic relations and EU's strategic dilemma. The return of Trump presents a complex challenge for EU leaders who find themselves caught in a precarious balancing act between U.S. demands and their economic relations with China. As Trump pushes for increased defense spending from European nations and threatens tariffs, the EU must navigate its internal divisions while attempting to maintain unity in its foreign policy. The psychological and economic pressures faced by EU leaders at international forums such as the World Economic Forum reflect their anxiety over the potential for a lose-lose scenario where succumbing to U.S. demands might lead to retaliation from China, further crippling the EU's already fragile economies. 3. Three potential scenarios for future trade relations. The analysis outlines three potential scenarios for transatlantic relations under Trump's renewed presidency: the grand bargain, the managed mess, and the perfect storm. The managed mess scenario appears most likely, where Trump reinstates previous tariffs, leading to a tit-for-tat response from the EU, but both sides avoid further escalation. In contrast, the perfect storm scenario predicts a breakdown in relations with widespread tariffs and a collapse of U.S. EU cooperation. These scenarios dictate not only the nature of US-EU relations but also the EU's approach to China. As heightened tariffs on Chinese imports could force the EU into a more defensive posture regarding its economic interests. For internal EU divisions and the challenge of cohesion, the EU's internal cohesion is tested as different member states prioritize their relationships with the US and China differently. Countries like Germany and Hungary, heavily reliant on Chinese trade, resist drastic measures against China, complicating the EU's collective response to US policies. The potential for a U.S.-China rapprochement wherein the U.S. shifts its focus away from punitive measures against China poses additional risks for the EU, which fears being left isolated and economically vulnerable. Thus, the future of EU-China relations will likely hinge on the EU's ability to unify its member states in the face of external pressures, while simultaneously managing the complexities of its relationship with both the U.S. and China. Three famous historical cases similar to Trump's economic agenda influencing trade relations. 1. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was legislation enacted to protect U.S. industry by raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. It was a response to the economic downturn during the Great Depression. The act aimed to stimulate domestic production by making foreign goods more expensive, thus encouraging American consumers to buy domestically produced products. However, it led to retaliatory tariffs from other countries, significantly reducing international trade. The global economy suffered further as countries responded with their own tariffs, resulting in a trade war that exacerbated the economic crisis. The Smoot-Hawley example illustrates how aggressive tariff measures can lead to unintended consequences that negatively impact both the initiating country and its trading partners. 2. The U.S.-China Trade War 2018-present. Initiated in 2018 under President Donald Trump, this trade conflict arose from concerns over trade deficits and intellectual property theft. The U.S. imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, aiming to pressure China into changing its trade practices. China retaliated with tariffs on U.S. products, leading to a tit-for-tat escalation. The trade war disrupted global supply chains, increased costs for consumers and businesses, and created uncertainty in international markets. This ongoing case reflects how a unilateral economic agenda can reshape trade relationships, provoke retaliatory actions, and create significant economic ramifications for both nations involved and their global partners. 3. The European Community's Common Agricultural Policy (CAP) in trade relations with the United States. Established in the 1960s, the CAP aimed to support farmers in the European Economic Community (EC) through subsidies and tariffs on agricultural imports. This policy led to tensions with the United States, particularly as U.S. agricultural exports faced high tariffs, which the U.S. argued were protectionist measures that distorted free trade. The CAP often resulted in retaliatory measures and negotiations between the U.S. and the EEC, impacting trade relations and creating a complex web of agricultural trade dynamics in the transatlantic relationship. This historical case parallels the current scenario, where economic policies and trade agendas can lead to contentious negotiations and require balancing domestic interests with international trade relations. The future outlook for international trade relations, particularly between the U.S., China, and the EU under Donald Trump's economic agenda by the end of 2025, presents a complex landscape characterized by potential turmoil, shifts in alliances, and strategic recalibrations. Below are key predictions based on current trends and analyses. 1. Increased tariffs and trade tensions. Trump's administration is expected to implement significant tariffs on imports from both the EU and China. His campaign signals a return to aggressive trade protectionism, with proposed tariffs of 10 to 20% on most imports and even higher rates on Chinese goods, potentially reaching 60%. This aggressive stance is likely to incite retaliatory measures from the EU, which may impose its own tariffs on U.S. exports, leading to a tit-for-tat trade war. The likelihood of escalating trade tensions is high, with many experts predicting a managed mess scenario where both sides engage in limited retaliatory actions but avoid full-scale conflict. 2. Impact on EU-China relations. The EU will find itself in a precarious position navigating between compliance with U.S. demands and maintaining its economic ties with China. As Trump's tariffs on China lead to a flood of discounted Chinese goods entering EU markets, European manufacturers may feel the pressure to protect their interests. This scenario could strain EU unity as member states with strong economic ties to China like Germany and Hungary may resist U.S. pressures to decouple from China. Consequently, the EU might adopt a dual-track approach, enforcing trade defense measures against Chinese imports while seeking to preserve economic relations. 3. Defense spending and security dynamics. A critical aspect of Trump's agenda will be pressuring EU nations to increase defense spending, particularly in the context of NATO. With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and mounting geopolitical tensions, European countries may feel compelled to enhance their military budgets to appease U.S. demands. This shift could lead to a realignment of security dynamics in Europe, with member states potentially prioritizing defense over economic stability, causing internal friction within the EU as different countries have varying security priorities. 4. Escalation of technology and economic warfare. The U.S. under Trump is expected to intensify its stance on technology transfers and economic sanctions, particularly against China. This could manifest in stricter export controls and a push for decoupling supply chains from China, impacting not only U.S. businesses but also European firms dependent on Chinese manufacturing. The potential for collaboration between the U.S. and its allies on technology policy could create additional pressures on the EU to align its regulations with U.S. standards, further complicating transatlantic relations. 5. Potential for a grand bargain. While the prevailing scenarios lean towards increased tensions and conflict, there remains a slim possibility of a grand bargain. In this scenario, Trump could negotiate a deal that includes concessions from the EU in exchange for easing tariffs. This might involve commitments to bolster U.S. defense contracts within Europe and increased imports of U.S. goods. However, the likelihood of this scenario hinges on the EU's willingness to compromise on its economic relations with China, which is fraught with internal divisions. 6. Political ramifications within the EU. The rise of populist movements in Europe, fueled by economic instability and dissatisfaction with the EU's handling of trade relations, could gain momentum as a result of Trump's policies. If EU member states fail to present a united front against U.S. tariffs and pressures, we could witness a fragmentation of EU cohesion, with individual countries pursuing bilateral relations with both the U.S. and China, potentially undermining the bloc's collective bargaining power. 7. Long-term implications for global trade. The broader implications of Trump's trade policies could reshape global trade patterns, with countries reassessing their reliance on both the U.S. and China. A shift towards more regional trade agreements may occur as nations seek to diversify their trade partners to mitigate the risks associated with U.S. tariffs. This could result in a reordering of global supply chains, with countries in Asia and Europe seeking alternative markets to reduce dependency on U.S. and Chinese goods. Conclusion. By the end of 2025, the international trade landscape will likely be marked by heightened tensions, strategic recalibrations, and significant political ramifications stemming from Trump's economic agenda. The EU faces a critical juncture as it navigates its relations with both the US and China, balancing economic interests with security commitments. The potential for conflict or cooperation will depend on the ability of both the US and EU to manage their complex interdependencies while responding to the challenges posed by China's growing influence. Ultimately, the trajectory of these relations will shape not only transatlantic ties but also the future of global trade dynamics.